Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him,
"Abraham."
"Here I am," he replied. Then God said,
"Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you."
Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied.
"The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?"
Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven,
"Abraham, Abraham."
"Here I am," he replied.
"Do not lay a hand on the boy,"
he said.
"Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son."
National Treasure is a 2004 action-adventure movie directed by Jon Turteltaub. The film follows the antics of Benjamin Franklin Gates, a treasure hunter. No, a treasure protector.
We're more like treasure protectors.
Of course, as we all know, Ben realizes that his next clue is on the back of the Declaration of Independence. He tries to get the Declaration through legitimate means, but ultimately settles on this plan.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
So Ben, his assistant Riley, and the real hero of the film, Dr. Abigail Chase, follow the clues on the back of the Declaration of Independence. They finally end up at Trinity Church in New York, where they go underground and ultimately find the treasure of the Knights Templar. There's lots of car chases and historical puzzles, and Nicolas Cage surprise kisses a woman he kidnapped. But the story itself is pretty straightforward. The good guys find a clue and solve it, but the bad guys are never very far behind. The good guys end up tricking the bad guys in the 11th hour and ultimately discover the treasure, which of course gets divvied up to its respective cultures. Ben, Riley, and Dr. Chase all skim a little bit off the top, and everyone gets their happy ending. This movie is basically a Da Vinci Code clone that focuses on the Enlightenment rather than the Renaissance. But there is a fundamental difference between the two texts. Much of the philosophy of the Da Vinci Code deals heavily with the divinity of Christ and the search for the Holy Grail. National Treasure, however, deals with the much more secular philosophies of the New World Enlightenment. Life, liberty, and so on. And this scene right here explains why that doesn't work out.
The Declaration.
Do you trust me?
Yes.
At this point in the story, they no longer need the Declaration. They've seen all the clues it has to offer, and they're already at the location of the treasure. And that's only assuming they can make it all the way. Ben only has the choice between Dr. Chase and the Declaration because this centuries-old wooden structure is breaking down. Who's to say they would even survive the rest of the journey? And yet Dr. Chase is willing to risk her life for this piece of paper. Granted, it's an important document, but it's not important for its physical form, but rather for the ideas it represents, for the independence it declared. Dropping this piece of paper won't suddenly return the United States to the custody of the UK. It won't change the past, and it won't really change the future since we already know everything that's on that document, including the invisible pictures on the back. And this idea is reflected throughout the movie. Ben constantly sacrifices material possessions to do what he believes is right.
There's thousands of years of world history down there, and it belongs to the world, and everybody in it.
You really don't understand the concept of a bargaining chip.
Because while the idea may be more important than the individual is more important than the material. Pretty simple, all men are created equal type stuff. If you told Benjamin Franklin, hey, I could get you a copy of this document for $35, or I could save the original and let a doctor of history die, I'm willing to bet he'd rather save the human being from death. The movie constantly jumps between worlds where the Founding Fathers are great thinkers and where the Founding Fathers are gods. Now don't get me wrong, I love sexy George Washington as much as the next person. But part of the whole more perfect union thing is the idea that people are not gods, not even our rulers, not even the slave owners who founded our nation. One of the lasting ideas of the Enlightenment is that leaders are fallible. Take this to its logical conclusion, and even Enlightenment thinkers would admit that their ideas were imperfect, which would perfectly explain why they left us a mechanism for changing those ideas. According to Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. Simply put, there are a few ways to amend the Constitution. First, an amendment must be proposed by either 2/3 of the House of Representatives and of the Senate, or by a constitutional convention called by Congress after approval by the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. This second option has never been used. Once an amendment is proposed, it can be ratified by 3/4 of the states through either their state legislatures or state-level constitutional conventions. This second option has only been used once, for the 21st Amendment in 1933, which repealed the prohibition of alcohol. And you know how when you have an empty tip jar, you throw a couple bucks in there so people get the idea? Well, the Founding Fathers left us a handful of amendments we know as the Bill of Rights. Since those first 10 amendments were ratified 229 years ago, the Constitution has only been amended 17 times. I'm just going to pick out a few highlights. Number 12 makes it so that presidential candidates select their own vice president. Before that, the runner-up of the election became vice president. Like, imagine a Bush-Gore presidency, or Obama-McCain, or Trump-Clinton. Wild. Number 13 abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment.
Someone's got to go to prison, man.
14 evened out some citizenship issues. If you're born in the US, you're a citizen, even if you are black. 15 prohibits the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 17 established the direct election of US senators by popular vote. 18 banned alcohol and 21 unbanned it. 19, of course, prohibits the denial of the right to vote based on sex. Real quick editor's note here. I want to point out the language that's used in some of these amendments. Notice that when the vote is granted to certain groups, it's actually just the prohibition of denying the right to that group. What this means is that even though the 15th Amendment prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the 15th Amendment didn't give black people the right to vote. Legally, you could still deny black people the right to vote, just not because they're black. 22 makes it so a person can only be president twice. 23 gives DC 3 votes in the Electoral College. 24 basically prohibited a poll tax. 26 guarantees the vote to people over the age of 18. And the most recent one, which was actually proposed with the original Bill of Rights, was ratified in 1992 and prevents members of Congress from giving themselves raises. Well, they can give themselves raises, it just won't take effect until the next election. So the 11th through 27th Amendments deal with election procedures, human rights, citizenship, voting rights, term limits, even the prohibition and subsequent legalization of a controlled substance. But let me remind you, the most recent amendment was ratified 28 years ago. Anything significant happened since 1992? We have a mechanism for changing the Constitution because even 18th century white supremacists understood that their ideas and values would not last forever. In fact, that's the whole thesis of the Declaration of Independence.
It means if there's something wrong, those who have the ability to take action have the responsibility to take action.
First and most urgently, we need to abolish the Electoral College. We just spent a week waiting to find out if the candidate with 4 million more votes would become president. The most popular defense of the Electoral College is that it prevents urban areas from having too much electoral say. But that is on its face undemocratic and therefore antithetical to the ideas of the Enlightenment. Why shouldn't cities and states with larger populations have a proportionally larger say in the presidential election? In fact, they should. The Electoral College disproportionately favors states with lower populations, and that's intentional. When the Electoral College was established, black folks still only counted as 3/5 of a person, but even so, they could not vote in the presidential election. So in a direct election where one voter gets one vote, an enslaved population would grant no advantage to the less populated southern states. By tying the presidential election to the population, including 3/5 of the enslaved population, rather than the number of eligible voters, slave states had a bigger chance of swaying the election. And that's it. That's why we still do it. It gives more power to the places with fewer people. Not a great system, especially since it has, on 4 occasions, denied the people their will. Ever notice how the presidential election never seems to hinge on California, even though that's the biggest state by population? That's because whether the vote is 11 million to 0 or 1 to 0, California gets exactly 55 votes in the Electoral College. And because California is a reliably blue state, none of their Republican voters really have any say in the election. So why waste money campaigning to 39 million people when you could get the same number of votes from way fewer? So that needs to be our first new amendment. And it's got majority support in the US. We could use amendments to make it easier to vote. We could have automatic voter registration so that everyone over the age of 18 is automatically eligible to vote. We could make it so that Election Day is a national holiday. We could make it so that no one can be denied the right to vote on the basis of gender as well as sex. We could prohibit housing and employment discrimination. We could admit DC and Puerto Rico as states. We could decriminalize drugs on a federal level. We could even guarantee a right to healthcare, clean drinking water, and quality education. The Constitution, just like the Declaration of Independence, is ultimately just a piece of paper. Sure, it represents ideas, but these ideas were written at a time when the writers considered black and indigenous people subhuman, women property, and LGBTQ+ people non-existent. And one of the most important ideas that these people wrote down is the idea that ideas change. As fucked up as the Constitution is, at least it comes with a built-in mechanism to make it less fucked up. And our first step needs to be to abolish the Electoral College. So call your senators, call your congressperson, and demand a constitutional amendment. We can't risk another presidential election being determined by this antiquated system. And we can't let any more people die just because we insist on holding on to this incredibly old document. It's just a piece of paper.